Tax credits are very important for some industries, film being one of them. They're certainly not the only important thing. For video game companies that I've spoken to, they've gone, the tax credit would be nice, yeah. It's about talent. And I think it comes back to who's the talent, right? So let's take the example of the film tax credit. Michigan up there, we upped our tax credit to 25%. Michigan up there is to 42%. When I was out in Hollywood meeting with a bunch of different people, they said, we just taste the tax credit to Michigan, and we're never going to do it again. Because we got there and they had no idea what they were doing. There was no infrastructure on the ground. There's nobody who knew anything about film. We had to bring everything in. It was the enormous pain in the rear, and they didn't know what they were doing. So, and that's a lot more money, 42% versus 25%. We have Emerson, I mean, we have an enormous sort of, we're one of the, we have a ton of documentary filmmakers here and a ton of film support people here. So they come to Massachusetts, they get what they need, and so I'm a strong believer in tax credits are good at incentivizing things, but it really comes back to what do you have on the ground to help. It's so much more than just that kind of incentive. So we are looking at tax credits, but I've heard from a lot of companies that that's, you can do that. It's an incentive. Yes, it's nice. But I mean, there was it Ubisoft that went to Montreal and I think, or no, it was EA that it went. I just heard this story yesterday. EA went to Montreal because there was all this action happening there, and they forgot to take their tax credits in the first 2 years because somebody had their accountant had to remind them that the tax credit existed. They went for the talent, right?
Canada is behaving badly at the moment. So the federal government is subsidizing their games industry. So in the UK, this is a pretty serious matter. I mean, we're, I think, the third largest producer of games, third largest market, actually. And what is interesting is that our young, new designers are now moving across to Canada and actually setting up businesses in Canada because they've got huge subsidies.
Yeah, the tax credit's big there.
Now, in global terms, what do you do about that? So I think there's not just a local tax credit sort of set of issues. There's actually how countries are behaving. There's another example, which is China. China has decided that it wants to export its publishing business into Europe. So it wants to create a foothold of its publishing, for its publishing companies in Europe. So what's it going to do? It's going to subsidize its publishing companies for the next 4 years, right? So they come into the European market, at a massively cheap price. That's the issue, I think. So I think we've got to be very careful to not just think locally about whether it's a state to state.
Oh yeah, we compare ourselves to Canada too. They're right there.
Yeah, exactly. Too many policies in the creative industries are about developing the supply side. In other words, producing more and more musicians, more and more artists, and so on and so forth. We've got to be quite careful about this, and this is why I think policies have got to be quite selective in terms of equally developing the market. And I don't see much of that, to be honest. Wherever I travel, I see very little effort going into market analysis and understanding all that side of it, looking at ways in which we can expand the market.
Well, that's actually the Adams Fund in Massachusetts. Not that we've got all this figured out, but the Adams Fund in Massachusetts, a lot of that funds developing the market, right? Festivals, music festivals, Cambridge Science Festival, Cyber Arts Festival, AHA, things that bring the creative industries to market. That's sort of one of the purposes of that fund is market share, increased market share. Because if you look at the nonprofit cultural industries, how do you increase jobs in them? You have to increase market share. That's the only way to do it. You can't or you can just keep giving grants to fund positions at museums, but it's all about market share for those guys. So, there's not an enormous amount of R&D that you can find. Like video games, it requires an enormous amount of R&D for people for years. You can have a lot of jobs in R&D for video games for many years before you have to really get to the market share question. But with the nonprofit piece, it's about, we're very focused on how do we increase their market share. Well, you have to, you can't just say we're going to look at the entire world. You have to say within each industry, what's our global strategy, right? So I'm saying within the creative industries, what's our global strategy for film? What's our global strategy for the design industry? Our designers are already working all over the world, right? what's our global strategy for video games? I mean, that's the way that everybody talks about it when I go to any of these conferences. So.
I want to mention this awareness of the importance of market puts us ahead of the game in a lot of senses, because it's not indicative of Western cultures, either European or North American. The Japanese, for instance, are just now coming to realize that they made a huge mistake about 10 years ago by funneling almost exclusively all of their massive subsidizing dollars, like Canada's doing now, but directly into the university system. What that created, you can imagine 5 years later, was this, from 5 to present, is this massive influx of highly talented, very creative, very enthusiastic students graduating from the Japanese university system with absolutely no jobs whatsoever.
Going to work in Berlin.
Right, so they left the country. So all of these fantastically talented, creative industry, entrepreneurial, creative technology, Japanese young mid-20s people had to leave the country because there were no jobs whatsoever. The ones that were there were paying minimum wage. So they're just now realizing, oh, wait a minute, we got to pay attention to market and customers and local use of all this talent. So.
Like the bringing of the Penny Arcade conference here, that's a user video game conference. That's where people go to play video games. It says 60,000 people come to Seattle to play video games. So we want to knock it out of the park with that and show that Massachusetts is a place that's friendly to that. And I mean, that is a market-based conference. So, I mean, there's ways to get at it, you know?
You need to have a view about growth in each of the subsectors. So actually, quite a lot of, when you start to unpack it, quite a lot of these companies just want to be lifestyle businesses. They're actually quite happy, to be running at a small scale, just enough to have a pleasant life, living in a nice part of the world. Thank you very much. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my view. So I think we need to be much more precise about what we're talking about here. And in my view, it points more and more to the large businesses, the medium to large businesses in any of the subsectors, as being the businesses we should concentrate on. And I would argue very strongly that concentrating on the large businesses, because if you can get them to increase their market share by a relatively small amount, the impact on that, on the whole of the subsector and related subsectors, will be far more beneficial.